The Soviet Union, in turn, possessed an immense railway web of over 85,000 kilometers, much of it single track and poorly maintained, yet capable of shifting entire armies across continental distances. Between these two incompatible systems lay the logistical frontier that would decide the war. In the months before June 1941, German engineers surveyed the border zones, cataloging bridges, junctions, and depots. They understood that victory depended on converting Soviet gauge to European standard as fast as possible. Specialized railway battalions were formed, each capable of regauging up to 20 kilometers of track per day. The Wehrmacht planned to push its supply trains forward behind the armies, extending new railheads toward Minsk, Smolensk, and eventually Moscow. Without those lines, fuel and ammunition would never reach the front in time. The Soviets, meanwhile, prepared their own defensive logistics. Decades of industrial centralization had taught them the value of mobility. Factories in Ukraine and Western Russia were linked by a network of feeder lines designed to sustain mobilization. But no one in Moscow expected a German attack of such scale. When it came, the Red Army was still reorganizing its transport commands, and the first weeks of the invasion found trains overcrowded, locomotives abandoned, and orders delayed. On 22 June 1941, as the guns opened fire, the railway war began. German armored spearheads advanced faster than any repair crew could follow. Tracks torn by bombardment, bridges blown by retreating Soviet troops, and depots set ablaze created a widening gap between the front and the supply lines. At Brest-Litovsk, one of the main junctions on the border, German pioneers worked around the clock to change the gauge and restore traffic. Within 10 days, the first trains rolled east, carrying ammunition, fuel, and rations for Army Group Center. Truck convoys attempted to bridge the gap, but the poor Soviet roads, dust in summer and mud in autumn, made road transport unreliable. Every delay on the rails multiplied tenfold at the front. By late July, the advancing armies already faced fuel shortages. The vastness of the territory, the incompatible rail gauges, and the destruction left by the retreating Soviets created the first logistical crisis of the campaign. Yet, in the first months, the momentum of conquest still carried the German forces forward. Rail engineers converted thousands of kilometers of track, captured hundreds of locomotives, and managed to deliver supplies deep into Soviet territory. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that logistics could keep pace with strategy, but the deeper the Wehrmacht advanced, the more fragile the system became. Locomotives designed for short European runs struggled on the long Soviet routes. Maintenance depots were hundreds of kilometers behind. Between February and June 1941, some 17,000 freight trains were reported by the Deutsche Reichsbahn to have been moved into border zones and staging areas in eastern Poland. These trains delivered armored vehicles, artillery, ammunition, and fuel to railheads positioned to support the advancing panzer and motorized formations. Concurrently, the Germans deployed rail engineering units, Eisenbahnpioniere, whose task was to convert captured broad-gauge Soviet lines to German standard gauge or to build new branch tracks to extend supply to the east. The Soviet rail system reacted under pressure. On the opening day of the invasion, sections of the USSR's Western rail network were disrupted by bombings, sabotage, and the rapid German advance. Although the Soviet Union's rail network encompassed over 85,000 kilometers of broad-gauge track pre-war, much of it was single-track, and the Red Army's Transport Directorate, VOSO, Voennoye Subchenie, found itself in crisis. Reports from late June 1941 indicate that large numbers of locomotives were diverted east of the Dnieper, as Soviet directives instructed the evacuation of industrial plants and rolling stock. By early July, German forces had secured vital rail junctions at Brest and Baranovichi, allowing the Reichsbahn to begin supplying Army Group Center's railhead at Orsha. From 30 June to 5 July 1941, German engineers regauged approximately 330 kilometers of track between the western border and Orsha, and by mid-July the German daily delivery to Army Group Center reached more than 6,300 tons. Meanwhile, the Soviet rail system in the contested zones suffered from constant interruption. Spares, fuel, and repair crews were limited, while German air and ground forces attacked rail yards, bridges, and rolling stock. At the same time, the reliance of both armies on railroads became evident. A German panzer division in full operation required around 300 tons of supplies per day, including fuel, ammunition, and spares. German intelligence believed the Soviet rail network would collapse under air and ground interdiction, but by early July it remained operational in many sectors, allowing the Soviets to continue troop and supply movements by rail. Command structures reflected the importance of rail logistics. The German OKH's Quartermaster Directorate placed rail capacity at the core of Army Group Center's advance, while on the Soviet side, the State Defense Committee, GKO, and the Main Directorate of the Rear began coordinating rail, road, and industrial evacuation. The fact that trains were being rerouted, depots rebuilt, and supplies forwarded, even as the front moved rapidly, indicated that the war would be decided not just by tanks but by rails. In these opening weeks, the railway war matured into a layered reality. The German advance depended not only on capturing rail hubs, but on sustaining forward movement of supplies along rails they had just seized or converted. The Soviet defense relied on shifting industry, preserving locomotive and wagon stocks, and keeping their rail network functional despite bombardment and retreat. The opening phase showed that strategic mobility would be measured in train loads, not merely in kilometers gained. As the German Panzer Group II closed on Smolensk, the ability of the Reichsbahn to maintain daily tonnage through newly captured railheads became as consequential as the speed of tanks. For the Soviets, the loss of rail junctions at Minsk and Orsha humored retreating armies and delayed counteroffensive supply. The front was not simply drawn on maps, it was laid in steel sleepers and prime tracks. The next weeks would determine whether Germany's logistical machine could outpace the distance, climate, and infrastructure of the Soviet Union. As the German armies pushed deeper into Soviet territory through July and August 1941, the logistics problem reached new dimensions. The war had turned into a race between military speed and the limits of railway capacity. Every kilometer of advance increased the strain on the supply network. Locomotives that once operated on short, efficient lines in Central Europe now labored across hundreds of kilometers of damaged track, exposed to dust, heat, and overuse. The Deutsche Reichsbahn's engineers, organized under the Feldeisenbahndirektionen, were forced to repair, rebuild, and re-gauge the lines as fast as possible, often under air attack or within range of enemy artillery. By mid-July, the German Army Group Center's primary railhead stood at Orsha, roughly 600 kilometers from the German border. Each day, approximately 15-20 trains brought in supplies, around 6,000 tons of fuel, ammunition, rations, and spare parts. But the needs of the field armies far exceeded what the railway could deliver. A single panzer army required 12 to 15 fully loaded trains daily to sustain operations. To meet the demand, the Germans pressed captured Soviet locomotives into service, hastily converted their wheels to standard gauge, and assigned crews to work shifts around the clock. Despite their efforts, the bottlenecks grew. The Soviet retreat, while costly, was not chaotic. Even as cities fell, the Red Army's rail units carried out systematic demolitions. Bridges were blown, rails twisted by explosives, and depots torched. The Soviets applied a simple rule. If a line could not be defended, it had to be destroyed. At the same time, trains carrying dismantled industrial equipment and entire factory workforces rolled eastward toward the Volga and the Urals. Between June and December 1941, more than 10 million civilians and workers were transported out of the threatened western regions. This massive relocation created congestion on every available line, but it ensured that Soviet industry survived. In occupied territory, the Germans inherited a wrecked railway system. The gauge difference, 1,520 mm for Soviet tracks compared to 1,435 mm in Germany, remained a constant obstacle. Engineers estimated that 20% of manpower in the railway troops was dedicated solely to gauge conversion. At the same time, the availability of replacement rails, sleepers, and fastenings began to decline. The Reichsbahn had expected to capture Soviet stockpiles, but the Red Army removed or destroyed most of them. By September, shortages of steel rails and wooden sleepers were severe enough that repair crews dismantled secondary lines to cannibalize materials for main routes. Weather added a new layer of difficulty. The summer heat dried the wooden sleepers, increasing the risk of derailments. Locomotive boilers, filled with poor quality water from rural wells, suffered mineral scaling that reduced efficiency. In the south, dust storms clogged air filters and bearings. German engineers calculated that almost half of all locomotives sent to the Eastern Front would need major overhauls by the end of the year. In reality, few would ever return to the Reich for maintenance. The Soviet side faced a different set of problems. The initial losses of locomotives, over 2,300 destroyed or captured in the first month, forced them to adopt emergency transport measures. Civilian traffic was suspended, passenger cars converted to freight, and every usable wagon commandeered for military purposes. In July alone, the Soviet railway system moved more than 150,000 wounded soldiers eastward, while simultaneously carrying ammunition, food, and reinforcements toward Moscow. Despite German air attacks on junctions and depots, the Soviet rail network retained flexibility by relying on alternative routes and pre-war contingency plans for rerouting trains. By the time the Germans reached Smolensk in mid-July, their advance had slowed. The distance between frontline units and supply bases exceeded 500 kilometers. Railheads lagged behind, forcing truck convoys to cover the final stretch. Each truck carried only 2 tons of supplies, yet consumed almost as much fuel as it delivered over those distances. This imbalance led to shortages that directly affected combat readiness. Several panzer divisions halted not because of Soviet resistance, but because they ran out of fuel or ammunition. In August, the High Command tried to solve the crisis by centralizing railway control under a single Eastern Railway Directorate. The idea was to coordinate all captured lines, allocate rolling stock, and set uniform priorities for shipments. But communication failures and local chaos undermined the plan. The front moved faster than the staff could issue orders. Within weeks, sections of newly converted track were already behind Soviet counterattacks, requiring re-repair or abandonment. The Soviets, for their part, exploited the delay. Reinforcements from Siberia and the Urals began arriving at the Moscow rail ring by late September. Each division, around 12,000 men and hundreds of tons of equipment, arrived entirely by train. Rail transport allowed them to concentrate manpower rapidly, offsetting losses and creating new defensive lines. While the Germans struggled to move supplies east, the Soviets were already shifting armies west. By autumn, the reality was clear. Logistics, not tactics, would decide the campaign. The Germans had advanced over 700 kilometers, but their railheads were still only halfway to Moscow. Each day the trains arrived later, carried less, and traveled on rails increasingly threatened by partisans and weather. The railway war had entered a new phase, one where supply, rather than combat, would determine the limits of victory. By the onset of autumn 1941, the railway war had reached its critical point. The Wehrmacht's striking power depended entirely on the extension of its supply lines, and the steel rails were stretched to their breaking limit. Every locomotive, every wagon, every meter of converted track became an irreplaceable resource. Army Group Center stood within reach of Moscow, but its rail lifeline still ended hundreds of kilometers to the west. The promised speed of blitzkrieg had turned into a crawl, dictated by the pace of railway construction. The German rail engineers worked relentlessly. Their goal was to push standard gauge lines eastward from Brest through Minsk and Smolensk toward Vyazma and Mozhaisk. Each kilometer required surveying, track replacement, bridge repair, and conversion of switches and stations. By October 1941, roughly 10,000 kilometers of Soviet track had been converted to German gauge, but much of it remained single track, without signaling or sidings. The daily tonnage reaching the front dropped sharply as trains were forced to queue on congested lines. German field commanders complained that fuel and ammunition arrived days late, and at times only half the requested loads reached depots. At the same time, the Soviets transformed railways into defensive weapons. As German spearheads neared Moscow, the Red Army relied on the rail network to transfer reinforcements from the east. Entire Siberian divisions, brought from Khabarovsk, Irkutsk, and Novosibirsk, arrived in the Moscow region within weeks. Their deployment, made possible by intact broad-gauge lines beyond the Volga, stabilized the front. Soviet railway brigades repaired tracks under bombardment, rerouted traffic around destroyed bridges, and established makeshift stations in forests to conceal rolling stock from air attack. Weather dealt a decisive blow to both sides. In October, the Rasputitsa, the autumn mud season, turned unpaved roads into rivers of clay. Truck convoys sank axle-deep, horse-drawn carts stalled, and only railways could still move supplies in volume. But even the rails suffered. Flooded embankments collapsed, and wooden sleepers shifted under the weight of overloaded trains. The Germans lacked gravel ballast, relying instead on whatever soil they could find. Derailments increased, locomotives ran out of spare parts, and repair crews labored knee-deep in mud. The Reichsbahn's monthly reports from November 1941 recorded losses of nearly 200 locomotives due to mechanical failure and accidents east of Smolensk alone. The advance toward Moscow magnified the consequences. As railheads fell behind, the distance from supply depots to the combat zone stretched to over 600 kilometers. German quartermasters estimated that half the fuel shipped from Poland evaporated in transit or was consumed by the trucks that hauled it. Ammunition shortages became common, and even bread deliveries faltered. Some divisions received rations only every second day. Meanwhile, the Red Army, though battered, maintained steady resupply by rail from the interior. Soviet trains, painted in camouflage and operating mostly at night, continued to deliver fuel, shells, and winter clothing to the capital. When the first snow fell in late November, the situation worsened. The German locomotives, designed for temperate climates, suffered frozen pipes and cracked boilers. Coal and water supplies became inconsistent, forcing trains to halt for refueling at improvised depots. Engineers recorded that the frost reduced efficiency by almost 40%. Soviet locomotives, better insulated and built for severe winters, functioned more reliably. They now carried reinforcements for the counteroffensive that would begin in December. The Wehrmacht's inability to extend its railway network beyond Vyazma proved fatal to its hopes for a quick victory. When Operation Typhoon, the drive on Moscow, began in early October, the supply chain could no longer sustain the pace. Of the 20,000 tons of supplies demanded daily by Army Group Center, only 8,000 tons were delivered to the front. Shortages of lubricants and anti-freeze immobilized vehicles, and artillery batteries rationed shells. In many units, soldiers resorted to melting snow for water and burning wooden structures for heat. On the Soviet side, the logistical picture was hardly smooth, but it was improving. The State Defense Committee had centralized the railway system under military control. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union used the same winter to recover. Their railways became lifelines for the defense of Moscow and the transfer of reserves to the southern fronts. Locomotives brought not only reinforcements, but the material of survival: coal, food, and warm uniforms. The Soviet system, though battered, had an advantage in design. Its heavy steam locomotives, such as the FD and IS series, were engineered for extreme cold. They burned lower-grade coal and could operate in temperatures below 40 degrees Celsius. German engines, designed for shorter routes and milder climates, froze solid overnight. During the spring thaw of 1942, new problems emerged. The melting snow turned the ground beneath railways into mud, loosening ballast and distorting tracks. The German engineers lacked gravel and concrete, using wooden supports that sank into the soft soil. The Rasputitsa of April and May halted most rail traffic in occupied territory. Trains derailed by the dozens. Repair units struggled to stabilize embankments, often resorting to packing them with frozen logs and sandbags. In some areas, entire rail segments had to be abandoned until the ground dried. By the time operations resumed in late spring, Both sides were preparing for renewed offensives. For the Wehrmacht, the 1942 campaign, Operation Blue, was designed to capture the oil fields of the Caucasus. This plan, however, required a colossal logistical chain running from Germany through Poland, Ukraine, and the Don region. Supply lines for Army Group South depended entirely on railways. From May to August 1942, more than 12,000 trains were dispatched toward the southern front, each carrying 1,100 tons of supplies. The network stretched 1,500 kilometers from the Reich to the Don, an engineering feat but also a fatal vulnerability. Every additional kilometer weakened the system. Coal had to be brought from Silesia, rails and sleepers from Germany, and replacement locomotives from France or Czechoslovakia. The strain was immense. Fuel for trains alone consumed 10% of the Army's total petroleum reserves. Worse, partisans had begun to target rail infrastructure systematically. In Belarus, Ukraine, and Western Russia, organized resistance blew up bridges and culverts, derailed trains, and ambushed repair crews. German records indicate that between March and July 1942, over 300 rail sabotage incidents occurred monthly across occupied territories. Each explosion delayed supplies for days. The Soviets called this new campaign the Rail War. Behind enemy lines, tens of thousands of partisans coordinated attacks with the regular army. They placed mines beneath rails, derailed ammunition trains, and destroyed communication lines. German countermeasures were ruthless: armored trains, patrols, mass reprisals, but never entirely effective. By 1943, Soviet partisans would destroy or disable more than 20,000 wagons and 6,000 locomotives. The railway had become not just a tool of supply, but a target of strategy. Inside the Soviet Union, logistics turned increasingly efficient. The relocation of industry eastward, completed in early 1942, transformed cities like Sverdlovsk, Chelyabinsk, and Magnitogorsk into industrial giants. Each of them sat on newly expanded railway hubs, feeding production to the front. Trains loaded with T-34 tanks, Katyusha rockets, and shells departed east of the Urals in endless succession. The Soviet railway system, though exhausted, was now integrated into a single wartime machine controlled directly by the State Defense Committee. By contrast, the Germans never achieved a comparable unity of command. The Reichsbahn operated under both civilian and military authorities, leading to constant disputes over priorities. Thousands of kilometers of damaged, overstretched, and sabotaged railway lines bound the German armies to an impossible front. The retreat westward began not only with infantry and tanks, but with locomotives, freight cars, and dismantled rail equipment dragged back from the ruins of the Volga. From spring 1943 onward, the railways became the heart of the strategic contest. The Wehrmacht's logistics system was now operating at the limits of endurance. The Eastern Directorate of the Deutsche Reichsbahn managed roughly 13,000 kilometers of captured track, much of it broad gauge or hastily converted, but partisan activity made continuous operation impossible. Entire sections disappeared overnight, bridges blown, telegraph poles cut, rails mined. In the first half of 1943, reports logged over 7,000 sabotage incidents on occupied railways. On average, 20 to 30 trains were derailed each week. The Germans deployed armored trains, rail-mounted flak batteries, and repair battalions, but the losses far exceeded their ability to recover. The summer campaign of 1943, Operation Citadel, demonstrated how decisive logistics had become. The planned offensive around Kursk required the daily delivery of over 20,000 tons of fuel and ammunition. To achieve this, German railway engineers had to repair and extend two key corridors, Bryansk-Orel and Kharkov-Belgorod. For weeks, trains carried supplies toward the front, while Soviet partisans, coordinated by Moscow under Operation Rail War, launched synchronized attacks across Belarus, Ukraine, and Western Russia. Between August and September 1943, more than 300,000 rails were destroyed, paralyzing the movement of trains for up to 10 days in critical sectors. The consequences were immediate. As the Kursk offensive stalled, supplies failed to reach forward units. Armored formations ran short of fuel. Artillery batteries received half their ammunition quotas. The Reichsbahn calculated that only 60% of required tonnage was reaching the front during the first week of July. When the Soviets counterattacked, their own railway network proved decisive. Reinforcements and reserves moved seamlessly from the interior to the battlefield. During the Kursk operation alone, Soviet railways transported 1.5 million troops, 300,000 tons of ammunition, and over 1,000 tanks to the front. Behind the lines, the Soviet partisan movement expanded the concept of railway warfare into a strategic weapon. Bridges became primary targets. Small detachments carried explosives, dismantled switches, and tore up sleepers. In Belarus alone, between July and December 1943, partisan groups destroyed or damaged 6,000 locomotives and 19,000 freight cars. German engineers, forced to rebuild under constant threat, spent more time repairing rails than delivering supplies. For every kilometer restored, another was blown up somewhere else. As Soviet forces advanced westward in late 1943, they captured not only territory, but the infrastructure that would power their next offensives. Teams of railway engineers followed the Red Army's spearheads, repairing tracks within days of liberation. In a single month, November 1943, Soviet rail brigades restored 2,000 kilometers of line across Ukraine, reconnecting Kharkov, Poltava, and Kiev to the main supply grid. Trains carried ammunition to the front and evacuated civilians in the opposite direction. This rapid reconstruction allowed the Red Army to maintain operational momentum, a feat impossible for the Germans, whose supply lines now collapsed under constant retreat. For the Wehrmacht, each kilometer lost meant another section of railway abandoned or destroyed. The German High Command ordered systematic demolition of bridges and depots to slow pursuit. But this self-destruction crippled any hope of organized withdrawal. Between August and December 1943, German forces blew up over 10,000 railway bridges in Ukraine alone. The very infrastructure that had once enabled their advance now became fuel for the fires of retreat. Civilian suffering increased accordingly. The railway system in the occupied territories had long served as the conduit for forced labor and deportations to Germany. As the front moved west, these same lines became escape routes for refugees. In some areas, trains carried both retreating soldiers and civilians fleeing the destruction. Food trains for the Wehrmacht took precedence, leaving towns without provisions for weeks. Starvation and disease followed wherever rail services failed. By early 1944, the balance was clear. The Soviets had regained full control of the strategic rail corridors linking Moscow to Leningrad, Kiev, and the southern industrial regions. The integration of newly liberated lines into the national grid restored wartime logistics to near pre-1941 capacity. The Red Army's ability to launch large-scale offensives now depended on uninterrupted rail support. For every kilometer advanced, engineers laid down temporary sidings, rebuilt bridges, and installed telegraph lines. By June 1944, before Operation Bagration, Soviet railways were carrying an average of 90,000 tons of supplies per day to frontline sectors. The Germans, by contrast, were collapsing under logistical exhaustion. Fewer than 1,500 locomotives remained operational in the east, compared to over 4,000 the year before. Coal shortages forced trains to run on wood-burning conversions. The Eastern Directorate reported that up to 60% of freight cars were immobilized due to damage or lack of maintenance. As Soviet offensives gathered momentum, German trains could no longer keep pace with retreating divisions. Units ran out of fuel midway through withdrawal, abandoning heavy equipment along the tracks. The railway war had evolved from a background struggle into the central mechanism of victory and defeat. The Soviet Union's mastery of repair, organization, and endurance had transformed a broken system into a logistical weapon. Germany's overextended network, designed for conquest, had become a trap. What began as a technical challenge of gauge and distance had turned into a moral and strategic collapse. By 1944, the iron roads that once promised victory were now leading the Wehrmacht inexorably home. By the beginning of 1944, the contest of logistics on the Eastern Front had decisively turned in favor of the Soviet Union. The railways that had once carried invasion trains from Berlin now groaned under the weight of retreat. For the Germans, supply lines had become a shrinking network of disjointed routes. For the Soviets, they were the arteries of an advancing empire. Each side's command understood that the ability to move men and materiel, not merely to fight, would determine the outcome of the war's final phase. The Soviet State Defense Committee had, by this time, achieved a level of logistical coordination unprecedented in military history. The People's Commissariat of Railways, NKPS, operated as both a civilian and military authority, merging industrial production and transportation into a single command economy. Thousands of railway brigades, some drawn from former factory workers, others from liberated regions, followed immediately behind the advancing front. Their task was clear: restore the line, reconnect the grid, and feed the offensive. Within days of liberation, trains were running again. The speed of restoration astonished German observers. By the spring of 1944, the Soviets were repairing railways at an average rate of 30 to 40 kilometers per day. Meanwhile, German control of the rail system disintegrated. The Eastern Railway Directorate had once operated as a massive logistical institution with multiple regional offices, but constant retreat had made central planning impossible. Lines were destroyed faster than they could be rebuilt. Rail junctions in Vitebsk, Mogilev, and Kovel were turned into smoking wreckage by Soviet bombers. Even when temporary repairs were made, the constant pressure of partisan sabotage erased progress overnight. German supply officers complained that no train could be guaranteed to reach its destination intact. By March 1944, reports to the High Command admitted that up to 40% of freight trains were lost or delayed beyond usefulness. The Soviet approach to logistics was not simply about numbers, it was about doctrine. Soviet railways were planned to support successive operations rather than isolated campaigns. Each offensive was designed with logistics as its foundation. During Operation Bagration, launched in June 1944, entire railway armies moved alongside combat units. These formations, comprising tens of thousands of men, cranes, bridges, and locomotives, rebuilt the line as they advanced. Within 48 hours of capturing a city, Soviet engineers could restore through traffic to the nearest operational hub. This allowed a continuous flow of supplies, ensuring that advancing armies never ran dry. Operation Bagration itself demonstrated the full maturity of Soviet railway warfare. Over 400,000 railway workers participated directly in support of the offensive. They repaired 4,000 kilometers of line and transported nearly 1.2 million tons of fuel and ammunition during the operation. Every major axis of attack, Vitebsk, Orsha, Minsk, was supported by dedicated railway corridors. When German defenses collapsed, the Soviets used captured rail infrastructure to accelerate their pursuit. Their engineers even converted German standard gauge tracks back to broad gauge within days, restoring compatibility with Soviet rolling stock. For the Germans, this offensive shattered what remained of their logistical coherence. Entire field armies were encircled not just by enemy soldiers, but by the destruction of their transport routes. As Soviet advances severed the main east-west rail lines, the Wehrmacht's depots were cut off from one another. Attempts to establish supply by road were futile. Fuel shortages, broken vehicles, and destroyed bridges left convoys stranded. What had once been an integrated transport network became isolated pockets of survival. The German response grew increasingly desperate. Armored trains, once symbols of security, now served as mobile strongpoints, retreating from one destroyed station to another. The railway, which had once symbolized modern order and precision, had turned into a corridor of desperation. On the Soviet side, the human toll was different, but equally vast. Railway workers operated under extreme danger, repairing lines under artillery fire, clearing mines from bridges, and sleeping beside steaming locomotives in sub-zero cold. Casualties among rail brigades during the 1944 offensives reached tens of thousands. Yet the sense of purpose remained absolute. The Soviet press celebrated them as the soldiers of the rear, whose silent victories enabled those at the front. By autumn 1944, the contrast between the two systems was complete. German logistics had become reactive, improvised, and defensive. Soviet logistics were proactive, planned, and overwhelming. The numbers told the story. In 1941, the Germans had moved 20,000 tons of supplies daily on the Eastern Front. By late 1944, that figure had fallen below 6,000. And by 1944, it was clear that only one of them still knew how to keep its trains running. By early 1945, the railway war reached its climactic conclusion. The Soviet juggernaut, driven by the strength of its restored transport network, stood poised along the Vistula and Neman rivers, ready to deliver the final blow to the Third Reich. What had begun 4 years earlier as a logistical nightmare for a retreating nation had evolved into a model of industrialized warfare, where rails, switches, and freight timetables were as decisive as tanks or artillery. The Germans, by contrast, were collapsing under the weight of their own overstretched infrastructure. Every day, hundreds of locomotives were lost to air raids, sabotage, or simple exhaustion. Every kilometer of track destroyed was another nail in the coffin of their empire. The Soviet High Command had learned that wars were won not only through combat, but through relentless organization. Before launching the Vistula-Oder offensive in January 1945, the State Defense Committee directed a logistical effort of unprecedented scale. Over 3,000 railway trains assembled on the eastern bank of the Vistula, delivering 1.7 million troops, 28,000 guns, and 7,000 tanks to the jump-off positions. More than 150,000 wagons of ammunition and supplies were concentrated within striking distance of the front. Each army received its own railway corridor, with timetables calculated down to the hour. Soviet planners built temporary sidings, fuel depots, and field stations at record speed, often overnight, ensuring uninterrupted supply once the offensive began. When the Red Army advanced, its logistics followed seamlessly. As soon as railheads moved forward, brigades of engineers replaced wrecked sleepers, repaired bridges, and extended communication lines. Within 48 hours of crossing the Vistula, trains were already rolling into captured territory. The Soviets had developed a rhythm of reconstruction unmatched in history. Rails were laid at a rate of 40 to 50 kilometers per day, despite freezing temperatures and constant air attacks. Each train arriving at the front carried 800 to 1,000 tons of supplies, fuel, shells, and rations, sufficient to keep the offensive rolling without pause. In contrast, the German rail system inside the collapsing Reich was fragmenting beyond repair. Allied bombing had reduced many key junctions in Silesia, East Prussia, and Pomerania to rubble. Freight yards, once bustling with trains, were now cratered wastelands filled with burned wagons and derailed engines. The Reichsbahn, once the pride of German engineering, was no longer a functioning institution. Many locomotives were abandoned for lack of coal or water, while others were requisitioned for evacuation trains carrying civilians westward. Between January and March 1945, as the Soviet armies advanced into East Prussia and Upper Silesia, over 2 million refugees attempted to flee by rail. Few succeeded. Trains overloaded with passengers froze on sidings or were bombed en route. The same lines that had once carried conquest now carried tragedy. In East Prussia, the logistical nightmare turned into catastrophe. When the Soviet Second and Third Belarusian fronts launched their assault, the German command attempted to evacuate troops and civilians through the port of Königsberg and by railway toward Danzig. But with bridges destroyed and the lines cut by advancing Soviet spearheads, the entire evacuation plan collapsed. Reports from the Eastern Directorate described scenes of chaos: endless trains stuck on frozen tracks, locomotives without crews, depots abandoned with thousands of wagons still loaded with fuel and ammunition. In some regions, retreating troops dismantled rails to deny them to the Soviets, only to trap their own supply trains in the process. The Soviet advance relied on meticulous coordination. Each front was paired with its own railway administration. For instance, the First Belarusian Front was supported by the Central Railway Directorate, operating 30,000 personnel and 900 locomotives. Their mission, to ensure continuous traffic from Lublin and Brest toward Poznan and Berlin. Every 50 kilometers, mobile depots were established to refuel trains and replace damaged rolling stock. Soviet railway soldiers, an entire branch of the army numbering nearly 300,000 men, functioned like combat engineers. They built pontoon bridges capable of carrying freight trains across rivers, cleared mines, and installed prefabricated steel trusses within hours. While Soviet logistics reached their zenith, the German situation became apocalyptic. In February 1945, the Reichsbahn's records showed that less than 30% of locomotives remained operational. Many railways in the east had ceased to exist altogether, either destroyed by the enemy or by retreating forces. The transportation of supplies to the front was virtually impossible. Ammunition and fuel had to be trucked in small quantities over snow-covered roads. Frontline divisions, once supported by a dense rail network, now fought in isolation, receiving only fragments of what they required. The collapse of the logistical base meant that even victories on the tactical level could not be sustained. The symbolic end of the German railway effort came during the encirclement of Berlin. In April 1945, as Soviet artillery surrounded the city, the last functioning trains entered the capital through the southern approaches near Potsdam. These trains carried wounded soldiers, government documents, and the remnants of supplies from Silesia. Within days, the lines were cut by Soviet advance guards. Railway stations, Anhalter, Görlitzer, and Lehrter became fortresses, filled with troops using locomotives as barricades. The Reichsbahn's last report, issued on 25 April 1945, stated that organized rail traffic east of the Oder no longer exists. Meanwhile, Soviet railway troops continued operating almost until the end of hostilities. They maintained a steady stream of supplies into the front zones of the First Belarusian and First Ukrainian fronts, ensuring constant pressure on the German defenses. During the final assault on Berlin, railway supply reached its most efficient point. 130,000 tons of materials were delivered to the advancing fronts in a single week. Even as fighting raged in the streets, Soviet engineers were already planning to reconnect Berlin's stations to the broader European network. The railway war, by its final year, had transformed from an invisible logistical struggle into a measure of civilizational endurance. The German system, once mechanized, disciplined, and efficient, collapsed under ideological delusion and overextension. The Soviet system, born of necessity and suffering, proved capable of regeneration and adaptation at every stage. Where the Germans had seen rails as lines of conquest, the Soviets saw them as lifelines of survival. By the spring of 1945, the railways of Eastern Europe lay in ruins. Yet amid the twisted metal and burned sleepers, the outcome of the war was written clearly. Germany's defeat was not decided solely in the trenches or skies, but in the endless struggle to keep trains moving. The side that could repair, fuel, and coordinate faster ultimately controlled the pace of history, and in that contest, the Soviet Union had won. When the guns finally began to fall silent across Central Europe in May 1945, the wreckage of the railway war stretched from the Oder River to the Pacific coast. What had begun in 1941 as a contest of steel, speed, and precision ended as a wasteland of broken tracks, burned bridges, and silent locomotives. Nowhere else in history had logistics played such a direct role in determining victory and defeat. The Eastern Front had not merely been fought on rails, it had been defined by them. The first months after Germany's surrender revealed the scale of destruction. In the territories between the Elbe and the Urals, more than 80,000 kilometers of track lay damaged or dismantled. Over 10,000 bridges had been destroyed, 15,000 locomotives rendered unusable, and hundreds of thousands of freight cars lay abandoned along embankments or in craters. In Poland, Ukraine, and Belarus, Entire stations had been wiped from maps. At Minsk, the once massive rail yard, capable before the war of handling 1,000 trains a day, was reduced to twisted rails embedded in rubble. The war had consumed not only men and machines, but the very arteries of civilization. The Soviet Union, emerging victorious but exhausted, began immediate reconstruction. Railway troops and civilian engineers, those same men who had rebuilt under fire, now labored to reconnect the shattered empire. Between 1945 and 1948, more than 45,000 kilometers of track were restored, often by hand. New steel was scarce, so rails were scavenged from wrecks or melted down from captured German stock. Locomotives from the United States and Canada, delivered under the Lend-Lease program, formed the backbone of the immediate post-war fleet. American-made Alco and Baldwin steam engines, shipped across the Pacific to Vladivostok, became symbols of recovery in the ruins of war. The railways also became the framework for occupation and control. As the Red Army advanced into Eastern and Central Europe, it used the same logistical system that had powered its victories to consolidate political authority. Soviet railway detachments restored and operated key lines in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany, ensuring that supplies and troops could move freely across the emerging Soviet sphere. Berlin, Vienna, and Warsaw were soon connected to Moscow by functioning routes. Freight trains carried not only reconstruction materials, but also entire factories dismantled from Germany and transported eastward as reparations. Steel presses, turbines, and machine tools arrived by rail in the Urals and Siberia, reversing the direction of wartime conquest. For Germany, the post-war picture was one of dismemberment and paralysis. The once mighty Deutsche Reichsbahn was divided between the Soviet, American, British, and French zones of occupation. In the east, it became the Deutsche Reichsbahn of the GDR. In the west, fragments were reorganized under Allied administration. The railway had been both the instrument and the victim of Hitler's ambitions. Its tracks had carried millions of soldiers eastward and millions of deported civilians to their deaths. Now, under occupation, it carried coal, rubble, and prisoners of war returning home. The scale of destruction forced the German people to confront how deeply their own industrial prowess had been consumed by the war they had unleashed. The Soviet narrative of the railway war became one of triumph through endurance. In propaganda films and literature, railway workers were portrayed as silent heroes, those who forged victory from the anvil of transport. Monuments were erected to honor the railway soldiers who had laid down their lives rebuilding bridges under fire. The story of the broad-gauge tracks rolling westward toward Berlin became a symbol of the Soviet capacity to transform defeat into momentum, chaos into structure. The railways, once symbols of imperial exploitation, now served as evidence of collective will and socialist reconstruction. But behind the heroism lay immense human suffering. Millions of displaced persons wandered the same rail lines that had carried armies and refugees. Many traveled in open wagons, searching for lost families or new homes. For years after 1945, trains across Eastern Europe were filled with survivors returning from forced labor camps or concentration camps, weak, starving, and uncertain of what awaited them. Stations became both sanctuaries and cemeteries. In the first two post-war winters, thousands froze to death in unheated carriages while waiting for transport east or west. Yet even in devastation, the railways remained indispensable. The railway war had written its verdict not in proclamations or speeches, but in the quiet, relentless turning of iron wheels toward the west, a sound that marked both the death of one empire and the survival of another. When the smoke cleared and Europe began to breathe again, the legacy of the railway war remained carved into the continent like deep iron scars. The Eastern Front had been more than a clash of ideologies or armies. It had been an industrial duel of endurance, fought through tonnage, steel, and human will. Every line of track that crossed the plains of Eastern Europe had once been a battlefield. Every station had witnessed triumph or tragedy. And in the silence that followed 1945, the echoes of locomotives and explosions gave way to the slow rhythm of reconstruction. In the Soviet Union, the reconstruction of the railway network became an act of national rebirth. Stalin's government understood that the system which had carried victory could now carry recovery. Within 2 years, freight traffic had returned to pre-war levels, despite the loss of thousands of kilometers of track and countless locomotives. The Ministry of Railways coordinated one of the largest rebuilding efforts in history. Tens of thousands of kilometers were relaid, hundreds of bridges rebuilt, and new rolling stock produced in workshops that had once manufactured tanks. The same men and women who had laid rails under fire during the war now worked to connect a nation still reeling from its losses. For many of them, the work never truly stopped. Soviet railway brigades became the backbone of the post-war 5-year plans, extending lines into Siberia, Central Asia, and the Far East. Their methods, standardized during wartime, allowed for extraordinary speed and efficiency. The wartime experience of coordinating vast logistics chains taught Soviet planners how to synchronize production, transport, and military readiness on a national scale. The trains of peace could never entirely erase the memory of those of war. The Railway War also reshaped military doctrine across the world. Analysts and historians who studied the Eastern Front came to the same conclusion. Logistics was not a secondary concern, but the decisive factor in modern warfare. Tanks, aircraft, and artillery could only perform as well as the trains that fed them. The Wehrmacht had been defeated not solely by Soviet numbers or winter cold, but by its own inability to sustain its momentum through supply. The Soviet Union, though it suffered enormous losses, had mastered the logistics of total war. This understanding influenced every subsequent conflict, from Korea to Afghanistan, and every major infrastructure project of the post-war world. Beyond the strategic lessons, there was a deeper human story. The Railway War was not only about engines and steel, but about the millions who lived and died along the lines. Yet beneath that duality lay a timeless truth, that the capacity to organize, transport, and sustain life was as decisive as the capacity to take it. By the end of the 20th century, many of the wartime lines had been modernized or electrified, their origins remembered only in archives and veterans' memoirs. Yet the ghosts of the Railway War still lingered, in the names of stations, in rusting sidings half swallowed by grass, in the silent photographs of burned locomotives and engineers standing beside them. These remnants spoke of a war that was as much about movement as destruction, about persistence as much as power. In the final reckoning, the Eastern Front was decided not only by courage or command, but by endurance, the ability to keep the wheels turning when everything else had collapsed. From Brest to Berlin, from Stalingrad to the Baltic, the railways became the true front line of civilization's most destructive conflict. They carried not only armies, but the fate of nations. And when the last trains finally stopped and the rails grew cold, they left behind a single unspoken verdict, that in modern war, victory belongs not to those who strike the hardest, but to those who never stop moving forward.